Good morning, everybody. I just want to take a couple of minutes before we start the show here to welcome you all and give you a few housekeeping details as we go through the show, just so then you know how to engage with us, you know all of the ins and outs of what to be prepared for. I would also, at the very top of the show, like to acknowledge the lands that we are on here in Arizona. So the Global Sport Matters, which is a part of Global Sport Institute at Arizona State University, acknowledges that these lands do belong to the Maricopa and Pima peoples. And with that, I will turn it over to our host extraordinaire, Andrew Ramsamy.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you, everyone, for joining today. My name is Andrew Ramsamy, and I'm the Director of Digital Content for the Global Sport Institute and Global Sport Matters here at ASU. Welcome to another GSM Live, where we bring together experts to discuss pressing issues impacting sport. We encourage you all to share your insights with us. We're very social. We're on Twitter, so we would love for you to use the hashtag Global Sport Matters. That's hashtag Global Sport Matters. We've also recently launched a new podcast called The Huddle, where we share unabashed conversations and daring stories from the world of sport. I would love for you to check out a recent episode that we did with Gwen Berry. She's an Olympic athlete in track and field, and specifically does the hammer throw. Last year, while accepting her gold medal at the Pan American Games, she bowed her head and raised her fist while being on the podium stand. And as a result of that, she was sanctioned by the IOC. She talks about her experience and how the IOC has now issued a statement in light of everything that's going on, which to her is hypocritical. So be sure to check that out. The world is waking up in more ways than one. And if you've been following our GSM Lives, following our new podcast, The Huddle, you've been part of conversations with experts talking about the possibility of sport returning and maybe not returning, and the wider implications of COVID-19 and racial injustices that have driven thousands worldwide to streets to protest. However, in these conversations, we've looked at what's happening right now and what's about to happen next, but what's going to happen today. But what if we decided to, just for today, go way down, way farther into the future? So what good is congratulating ourselves today if in 1, 5, or 10 years from now, we're all in a same or potentially worse situation? So COVID-19 will definitely reshape everything that we've done. This moment that we're in, all of the threats that are lurking out there in the shadows. I mean, what's the boogeyman that's going to come for us? Can we ever really become comfortable enough to return to stadiums? And if we had a vaccine, would everything just revert back to business as usual? And today is June 19th, better known as Juneteenth, which commemorates the end of enslaved people in the U.S. But what can this worldwide pause do for us to tear down systemic racism in sport? And yes, there is no question, I don't think anyone is going to argue that there is racism in sport. But will it be a race to see whether or not we get a vaccine first, or if perhaps there is systemic change? Or as we as a society, are we willing to do more to move the progress needle forward? So today's show is going to look at what the future holds by examining threatcasting. Threatcasting allows us to better predict and prepare for the next decade. On the show is Brian David Johnson, the father of threatcasting, to help us make sense of what the industry should be worrying about. We've also got Kelvin Watt, Regional Managing Director for Africa and Asia at Nielsen Sport. And then later joining us is racial equality and organizational behavior expert, Dr. Deborah Stroman, as well as Professor Kenneth Shropshire, the CEO of the Global Sport Institute. So with that, let's start with Brian and Kelvin. Brian and Kelvin, thank you for joining us. And if you would make sure, unmuting, perfect. Brian, you and I have been talking about this threatcasting stuff now, seems like for months, years, but it's practically only been weeks with everything that's going on. What can threatcasting tell us about the future of sport?
Well, Andrew, by the way, thank you for having me on the show today. I really appreciate it. So really what threatcasting does is, as you said, is it looks not at what we're dealing with today, but what is the thing that's going to come after the thing? What's the thing just over the horizon? And so what threatcasting allows us to do is we pull in a lot of disparate information. We look at social science, we look at technology research, at economics, at cultural history. We do global expert interviews as a way to kind of push us past the dilemmas that we're dealing with now so that we can identify that range of possible and potential threats out into the future, sometimes 2, 5, 10 years out into the future. But then more specifically, we work with practitioners. And this is what I'm really excited about, and really excited about the work that we're doing at ASU around how do we bring together practitioners, give them this information and say, okay, let's have a conversation about how do we disrupt, mitigate, and recover from these threats? Because that ultimately is the goal. Yes, we want to identify the threats, but ultimately we want to figure out how to track them, figure out what the indicators are, and start to actively disrupt them today.
All right, so let's get practical. What are some of those top priority, threats that are out there?
So for myself, what I'm looking at is certainly, and as mentioned at the top of the show, is the venues. I think venues, and we do a lot of work with builders and sort of understanding sort of how will we build these out? Not only how will we retrofit and change the ones that we have today, and we're starting to see that. We're starting to see people bringing in virologists and pathologists and sort of understanding that, which is great. But I'm thinking about, what about the next stadium that we build? What about the next sports arena that we build? And how do we design it in a time where it might be pre-vaccine or post-vaccine, but we have an understanding of how we need to create more resilient venues and more resilient buildings that also make people feel safe. It's not just being safe from the virus, but make people feel safe. And so that's one of the areas that we're looking at. But the other one that I'm so deeply passionate about is understanding what's the next generation of athlete. I believe that we're at risk at having a lost generation of athletes who are living through this, who are coming out on the other side of it. What does that look like? And I'm not just talking about athletes who are professional athletes or sort of elite athletes. I'm more worried about our youth athletics. I'm worried about our young people who are coming up through the ranks, that we really need them to be engaged.
And Kelvin, you've been in the sports industry for decades, working on marketing and communications for some regional and large global events, sponsorships, focused on the fan experience and fan engagement and consumer trends, which is really on the side that sees the biggest impact from all of this right now, right, is the business. Tell us, what are you and the Nielsen team focused on in terms of technology and innovation and the impacts of fan engagement with what's going on in this moment?
I think one of the really difficult things that we're dealing with right now, and Brian alluded to it a bit, is what are we coming out to, and trying to understand that. And one of the difficulties, especially in the research business, is you can't ask people because they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
They fundamentally don't know what they're coming out to. So it's very difficult to ask them about how they're going to, interact with sport, how they're going to engage with sport, where they're going to be. So, right now for us, there's a combination of things. Is sitting with a lot of our rights owner clients and our brand clients, trying to understand, what the implications are, and what is likely to be the situation, and how we think that's going to impact based on what we know about a lot of people. And I think one of the things that's really come out of this whole COVID situation around the world is we sort of spot and identify trends. We're not working into the sort of future to the extent perhaps that Brian is, and we're probably not looking as much at the threats as more at the opportunities. Often tends to be where most of our business takes place. But the one thing that COVID has done, and it doesn't matter what market it seems to have happened to us, it's our North American, our Western Europe business. We've seen it through Asia, or Africa, Middle East, India, is that COVID sped a lot of things up. A lot of things that we've been saying, these are things that are coming, these are things that are happen. A Zoom call, the sort of technology that we are now, which is seemingly such a normal way now to communicate with a number of people, really didn't exist 2-3 months ago. And how are people going to start watching live sport? Are they going to do it with a Zoom call attached and 20-30 mates watching something on television and all interacting? So all of these things are going to be a completely different way of engaging. I think fundamentally though, everything that we're seeing, both from a fan perspective as well as from a participant, talking a bit, Brian, to your sort of lost generation, is that we have seen that people have generally come to understand the importance that sport played in their lives, and just how much they're missing it. And that could be their professional sports team, it's their kids' sport, it's watching on television, it's all of these elements. And it's also around fitness and participation, and certainly in countries where there was really a major lockdown. I mean, I live in South Africa, and we've probably had one of the most intense lockdowns anywhere in the world. given our sort of socio-economic situation, the government really felt that it was massively important to really lock us down. And I can tell you that the frustration of people not just being able to do the simple things of riding, cycling, children not being able to play any sport, it's really come to the fore just how much they've missed it. And as we've seen us sort of come through the phases of being unlocked down, it's extraordinary to see the level of participation. You know, as soon as you were allowed to run and cycle, the roads were full. And as certain practice venues have become available, the golf courses have, golf was under a lot of pressure. It is around the world, but it was under a lot of pressure in South Africa. You can't get a tee-off time anywhere in South Africa at the moment. You can't get onto a driving range. The kids are out there playing. So I hear, Brian, that there's a lost generation, but I think there's also been a generation of families, of kids, of all sorts of people who've realized just what it meant to them. And I think what we are going to see coming out of this is an explosion of, people anticipate. I think that, people are going to celebrate the fact once we get out of it and once we can move around more freely, I think we're going to see a high level of engagement, both at a participation and fan. Again, most of you live in the United States. Live sport in the United States tends to be full of people. If I go to most Asian markets, African markets, so sort of, Middle East, sports stadiums, the teams often are playing in 50,000 seater stadiums that were built for World Cups, but will have 5,000 people watching. Right. So that's a pretty typical situation. And I think what we're going to see is a lot more people wanting to go and experience that and be part of a live engagement. We're certainly seeing a hunger. I actually saw a wonderful quote from the coach at Liverpool, Jurgen Klopp. I don't know how many of you and your listeners follow football, but he's quite an entertaining German.
I do. I follow his eyewear.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's come out with a wonderful quote. That says, sport's the most important thing of all the unimportant things in life. And that's what, COVID's taught him. And, I think I certainly we're starting to see that as a trend coming out of a lot of the research work that we're doing, is people have just realized what an important part, emotional part of their lives it is.
Yeah. And Kelvin, you touched on something that's really important. And this will be a question for both of you, but I want to take it to Brian. Everyone wants to get outside. Everyone wants to be outside. But there's also something about outside. The world is changing, right? I mean, we're dealing with issues of global warming. The temperature of the earth is getting warmer. So for as much as we want to go outside, there's also this kind of force to get us back inside to protect us from the elements. And Brian, you were just talking about walking around ASU, and if you were to get lost, poof, you would evaporate into a puff of smoke. What are we dealing with global warming, and what has some of your work with FEMA shown?
So, as you mentioned, so I do a lot of threatcasting work thinking about the future of natural disasters, thinking about the future of sort of climate change and shifting climates. And it's important to realize that when we talk about climate change, it's really about destabilization, that it's about these destabilization of systems. When you have climate shifts, when you have major weather events, it really, really is starting to take the processes and procedures, the way that we did business, the way that we watch sport, the way that we move people around, and they've been destabilized. And all one has to do is just look at COVID, look at the pandemic. This is a massive global destabilizing event, where if you start looking at global warming and climate change, you're actually seeing it move around in different areas and actually affecting how people train, the times that people will go through and put the venues where they train. But one of the things, Andrew, I want to call out, that really COVID and the future of sports and sort of post leaving from being locked down, but also the future of climate change also teaches us this, is that the future is very local. I think this is one of the things that as a futurist that I've been telling people for many years, is that, but really with climate change as well as COVID has shown us this, is that where you live matters. It's very specific, and especially when it comes to sports, sort of where the venue is, especially if we're talking about live sports in a place where it's happening. This is where, in the work that we do with threatcasting, as you start to think about it, you start to think about, well, what does it mean, not for the world? It's not the future of all sport. It's actually, we need to look at different regions, at different cities, at different areas, at different leagues. And that's where it becomes really, really powerful, is that's where we really start to enable people to say, okay, this is what it means. You mentioned the work that I've done with FEMA. We were looking very specifically at fire in the West. We looked very specifically at earthquakes on the West Coast. We looked at hurricanes on the East Coast of the United States, to really look at, and actually working very closely with mayors, working very closely with first responders, and actually having them in the room. That's one of the things that I mentioned about threatcasting, is we actually bring together the practitioners. We bring together the people who are doing this, who are literally on the front lines, because as Kelvin was saying, you can't really go and do research with people and say, well, let's talk about these future threats. But what we can do and what I can do as a futurist is say, well, here's what I see coming 1, 2, 5 years, 10 years out. Let me put it in a very concrete way for you. Let's talk about what you would do. Let's say if you were the fire chief of Colorado Springs, what would that mean in Colorado if you started to burn? And what have you done in the past and what might you do differently? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do on all these different areas, is say, how do we give people sort of information, methodically break it down so they can start taking actions today to make people safer?
And Kelvin, your expertise is in Africa and in Asia. I mean, what's the pulse for the FIFA World Cup coming up in Qatar in 2022?
Absolutely. I mean, I think on the climate change, and obviously as things are getting warmer, one of the big things that is happening there in Qatar is they'll have 8 stadiums for the World Cup in 2022. One of them was already existing and it was sort of refurbished. The other 7 were purpose built for the event. And interesting, there's been a lot of work done on open air cooling technology for those stadiums, specifically to be able to host it, even though remember that this is going to be hosted in the middle of winter in Qatar. It's still going to be warm compared to, it's probably not going to be that much warmer than the German World Cup in 2006 from a player's perspective, but still, that technology is put in place. And I think what we will see as you sort of, people see the threats coming, is that the Qatari government, and I know that they've made a big investment with the Supreme Committee there into this technology, and because they're seeing that it has the ability to export this technology into other parts of the world. Quite frankly, from my side right now, on the heat side, I'm more worried about Tokyo 2021. If you haven't been to Tokyo in August, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinarily hot.
Not in a good way, I'm sure. You're not selling it like the CVB or the Tourism Bureau, right? You're saying extraordinary, not in a very intense way, right?
Yeah, it's hot. It's really intense and humid. So it's going to be really tough for people moving around there. And for anyone who's been to an Olympic Games, as a fan, you do a lot of moving around with a lot of people. Look, let's be honest, the Japanese know how to get things done. So their travel systems and all of those are going to work, and there's going to be a huge amount of, technology will be brought into play. And I've seen some of the technology that some of those global sponsors, Panasonic and others, are working with them on in a lot of the venues. But for some of those athletes, there's only so much you can do on a hockey AstroTurf for the marathon runners. As much as they're sending them into Hokkaido, into the north of Japan, it's still going to be really hot there. So, I think what we will see though is technology being forced to come into play. And to Brian's point, it's going to be horses for courses in different countries. People are dealing with different threats, and they're going to have to really understand those localized threats. And I guess a lot of the work that you're doing, for example, on the West Coast around fires, and that can just as well be used with the Australians around the Australian Open, cricket, and all those sports, which are really starting to get affected by the fires in Australia, Brian.
I have to tell you, Kelvin, you couldn't be more right. We actually, when we did that, we actually brought fire experts from Australia, because certainly if you want to know fire, you need to go to Australia. And I do a lot of work with the Australian government. So yeah, exactly.
And you look at the Australian Open, obviously the first Open of the year, and the first Grand Prix of the year in Formula One typically is almost always in that fire season. In and around Sydney and Melbourne. So both those events are massive investments. And I mean, the Australian Open, it was pre-COVID, the Australian Open was nearly called off this year because of fires. Right up until a week before, there was a lot of debate in Melbourne whether or not the Aussie Open would go forward. And that was before COVID. And who knew a month later they were going to lose the Grand Prix? I mean, that was just, no one would have predicted it.
Well, Brian and David, Kelvin, we're going to leave it there for now. We're going to bring you back on later to talk more about this. We're going to move on to our next segment and talk more about just what's happening right now in terms of the kind of systemic racism that's happened here in the U.S., the uprisings that have occurred, and what we're going to do in terms of long-term change and trying to end racism. But before we get to that, we're going to do a poll. So Kendall's going to come back in. And Kendall, what is our poll going to be on?
So we want to ask everybody what level of sport is under threat right now. So in your mind, thinking about, youth sport, collegiate sport, professional level, and we kind of split it up between men's and women's because there's obviously a lot of differences between those. We just want to ask you, what is what level of sport is most under threat right now? So we're going to launch that over, let you guys have at it.
All right. So which level of sport is under threat right now? We have youth sport, which would be K through 12, men's collegiate level sports, women's collegiate level sports, men's professional level sports, or women's professional level sports, or I don't know.
Which not many people are selecting that right now, so.
Oh, that's good.
That's really good.
As we're doing our poll, I would love to bring Ken and Dr. Stroman on. Not that I want you to use your thumbs to tip the scales here on our poll, but Ken, what do you think? Which level of sport do you believe is under greatest threat right now?
Kids. Yeah. So
kids.
The young. For two reasons. First is just generally the availability of sport and the access, and the second is those good parents that say, I ain't gonna let my kid play right now. I mean, and so at both levels. So the progress that they might be able to make for whatever value there is to making progress in sport at the highest levels, there's going to be real problems for kids. I mean, you see the NBA for, we're going to play in Orlando, we're going to play in Disney World, we're going to, so there's figuring this stuff out because there's money. But for the lowest level of kids where there is no money, that's where we're going to see the biggest holdup.
And Dr. Stroman, what do you think? What's the greatest threat right now?
I'd have to double down on what Ken said as well in terms of our youth. And not only for the reasons that he mentioned, but also just the fact that many of them aren't mobile. They're at home.
Yeah.
And technology is just, I think it's by design, but it just has them engrossed in these machines, whether that is a smartphone, whether it's the new video system, but they're just not getting outside and being active.
All right, Kendall, you have the results of the poll.
Got them. Sharing them right now. All right. So overwhelmingly, youth sport, 43% of you said that is the most under threat right now. Men's collegiate sport at 14%. Women's sport in both collegiate and professional levels, definitely more under threat, according to our audience, than the men's side. And only 2%. I don't know. So there you have it.
All right.
I'd like a trophy. Can I get a trophy, please?
Yeah, no. Well, you are our trophy, Ken. You are our trophy. We need a Shropshire statue for sure.
Okay.
All right. So we've seen the last few weeks, Ken and Dr. Stroman, these demonstrations in the U.S. and around the world, and it has sparked a global call to end racism. And athletes have been using their platform to raise awareness and a call for action, which we've seen many statements, leagues released from professional leagues, coaches, and sports. But now the athletes themselves are speaking up. So what does this momentum look right now, and how is this going to translate into the future? What could sport look like without racism? Wouldn't that be nice? So Ken, let's start with you. I mean, what does the future of sport look like without racism?
Well, that's why I'm not a bald guy with a big beard, because I can't, you talk about things that are hard to imagine, but I guess we, at some point, got over there being no Santa Claus too. So what does it look like? I mean, and I don't think you can think about sport, and rarely do I mix the two. You can't think about sport without racism, without thinking about sports without any form of discrimination, gender or otherwise. I mean, what would this magical moment look like? And I think it's, that's what we all talk about, is that you are allowed to progress or have access or develop just based on your abilities. And that would be both on and off the field. I mean, that's a really difficult thing to imagine, because then we have to imagine, as you have asked us to do, that there is no racism. And we're in a moment now where many will proclaim that they're not racist, either because they know that the best way to be a racist is to act clandestinely, or many are racist and they can act in ways that they act, and maybe they don't specifically label their actions as such. So we've got a long way to go, but thank you for allowing me to Threatcaster. We don't have to worry. It's not on the this is not like fires or pandemics. It's not on the immediate horizon, so we don't have to worry about it in that sense.
Well, I mean, but there's momentum, right, happening right now. And Dr. Stroman, we're seeing that from athletes and we're seeing that from citizens, both sports fans and non-sports fans. Is that enough of a catalyst for change, or do we need more of a push?
Well, as Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. Never has, never will. And so we're going to constantly need this attention. We're going to need this focus. I would also say that right now, Black culture, Black people are being seen. We're visible now. And what that means is there's a bit more curiosity about who we really are and what we're about and what our history is. And so it's no surprise that we see, not only do we see the corporate statements, the nonprofit statements, but now people are saying, I want some training, sign me up for this. You know, I think I saw in the news the other day that 13th, that amazing documentary by Ava DuVernay on Netflix is like breaking records, right? Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is you can't even get it right now. So there's curiosity, but the curiosity is in the brain. So it's an intellectual move. What about the heart? That's what I think Ken is saying. What about the heart? How do we move the heart to take an atrocity like a George Floyd and say, that is wrong. It's not spiritual. It goes against humanity. And so what's my action from that? So what's the heart move? You know, we get these patterns and associations from our family. We get them from our educational setting. We get them from our schools. We get them from the people we work with. But how are we going to shift that, those patterns and associations, to say that Black lives matter? And if we need to say Black Lives Matter, comma, TOO, then let that be it. But right now we're being visible, we're being seen, and people are awakened in the intellectual, the brain space. But how are we going to get hearts to move? That's the next step.
Yeah, so Andrew, I want to articulate this in the right way, but I want to try to say this, especially on this, in this Juneteenth moment, which is so,
yes,
I have so many mixed emotions about the co-opting, commodification, celebration of this. You know, my father was from Texas, and as a kid growing up in LA, which had a lot of Texas Black, you know, migrants there, we knew about this holiday. Was that kind of the summer of barbecue. Juneteenth was one of the days we did it, but everybody didn't know about it. And in some ways that was just fine because we understood what it meant. So in this moment, what I'm concerned about, I mean, and Deborah was involved in this moment in time too, when we demanded the King holiday, and we spent a lot of energy seeking the King holiday, and Arizona screwed up in that process, but another sports related story. We get it, but you know, there's so many things, and it's wonderful, so many things that are symbolic, and tearing down the statues and all this Confederate flag stuff, all very important, but that's the symbolism of the moment. And as Deborah says, that you can do that as a political kind of move, but the hearts and minds kind of transition, that's really what. So when you say, you know, what's the future going to be? Can we get there? That's why it's so hard for me to imagine how that looks, and that we're certainly headed in a better direction than we've been.
Yeah,
but it's not tomorrow.
And Dr. Stroman, I mean, this was a question we were going to ask Ken, but I'm going to ask you. I mean, what role do you think data plays in telling the story? I mean, at the Global Sport Institute, we just did a research study back in December looking at a 10-year snapshot of the Rooney Rule and actually looking at the data, seeing the racial disparity and how hiring exists between, you know, again, the haves and the have-nots. There's some spikes, you know, but overall, the 10-year look at this showed that there wasn't a lot of progress. So even an organization like ours that presents that data back to this community that is the decision makers, does data play a role in changing hearts and minds?
Absolutely. And in fact, when we think about the culture of the United States, which is a white dominant culture, in business, and business drives our country, you have to see the numbers. We can tell stories, we can talk about experiences, We can have lived experiences. I was affected by this. I wasn't promoted. Look at my pay scale, all of that. But people take action in this country when you have the numbers. And in particular, when you're talking about race and racism, right? And so we can have those examples of, you know, something happening to a person and person screaming at the top of their lungs, look what happened to me. But until you can bring in the numbers and to show the patterns and the trends, that's how we make a difference. And I'll say the best example of this is analytics in sports right now. Everyone knows that subjectivity is critical, that gut feeling. But when you can confirm that gut feeling by bringing in the numbers, let's say Johnny or Mary is a great three-point shooter, right? And you know it, you feel it. And the numbers back it up. But Johnny or Mary comes to practice or comes to the game that day and they've just lost a parent. Or they have the flu, right? So the numbers aren't going to match up. So we know subjectivity, absolutely it matters. But when you can put the two of them together, and that's what we're seeing in this space. And so I applaud you for doing the Rooney Rule, but there's so many other areas where we need to look at the numbers as in disaggregate by race, and then the truth will come out. And you put that in front of a policymaker, you know, if they can't move by seeing the numbers, plus they have the storytelling, then they don't have a heart. They are holding on to something, this tradition, this status quo that benefits them, that creates advantage for them, but they just don't see the humanity to make a decision.
Ken? I mean, I'm sure you've had several conversations with folks about the research that we've done, about all the data. What's the reaction to when that is placed in front of them?
So not surprising. I agree with Deborah, and I'd emphasize though, we need both. We need the data and we need the stories. I will tell you, when I first got into the academy, Pitney Bowes, you know, scale company back in the 80s, I don't know if they're still around or not, offered the school that I was at some hundreds of thousands of dollars to do work on, quantify for us the benefits of diversity. I don't know if diversity was a word in the mid 80s, but that's what and I remember being, you know, I was the black guy, so they brought me in to hear this pitch. And I remember being distressed, you know, what are you talking about? Why you don't have to figure that out to know that companies need to be more diverse, just do it. And, you know, 30, 40 years later now, it doesn't matter what my heart tells me is the right thing, that for the business enterprises to move forward, that data is necessary. The flip side though is, as much FBI data and everything else that we can have about the number of Black men being killed by the police, if we didn't have that graphic that we had, the two big ones that we've had in the past couple of weeks, the movement that we've had would not take place. So now everybody wants to go back to validate, oh, there is this problem. So we get the combination is so much more powerful than just one or the other.
Well, you know, we're going to continue this conversation, and in our next segment, we're going to talk about the role that racism plays as being a threat to sports. But we're gonna do a poll, and Ken and Dr. Stroman, we're gonna have you come back in just a few minutes. But Kendall, we have a new poll that you want to do, and what is that poll?
Yeah, so just kind of looking at, again, what area of sport, same answers as before, but what area of sport do you think will actually make the most change in support of the Black Lives Matter movement? So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll here and let you all have a chance to tell us whether you think youth sport, again, splitting up men's and women's on collegiate and professional level, which area of sport do you think will make the most change in support of Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, you know, it's really been interesting. I mean, we don't have NASCAR in there, but, you know, on the podcast, we talked about how a driver decided to come up with a paint scheme that was about Blue Lives Matter. Now, the name itself was not emblazoned on the car, but the actual flag that had been used to represent Blue Lives Matter was there. And that was as a direct response to what Bubba Wallace did to his car, which was literally putting hashtag Black Lives Matter on his car. And also, you know, the announcement of NASCAR deciding to ban the Confederate flag at its events. So they all need to be impacted by the Black Lives Matter movement for sure. Right, Dr. Stroman? Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think, again, we've got a language misunderstanding. And far too often, we don't honor and respect the nature, the complexity of race and racism. And we'll just listen to anybody, that crazy uncle, Thanksgiving dinner, the coworker who has an opinion, the wine and cheese reception, the ball game. But there is no doubt that this scholarship, this data has been collected for decades and for a century. And so we have that information. So we need to be more mindful of what the scholars, the academics, the community organizers, the institutional organizers who study this. It's, you know, it's like cancer. You know, you wouldn't just have an ear, nose, and throat person speak on it. You wouldn't just have the gynecologist speak on it. You need an oncologist. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of people are saying a lot of things and it's messing up the language. No one said that all lives did not matter. We know all lives matter. But what we're saying is, again, Black Lives Matter, comma, too. And that's what's going on. And that's what the data shows. And so, again, I think we have a language misunderstanding, lack of communication around race and racism.
All right, Kendall. So what were the results to the poll?
All right, so I'm a little surprised by this one. You know, call me a little bit of a pessimist here, but it's pretty cool. So coming in first, the area of sport that we think will make the most change and support, men's professional level was 64%. So I wonder if that's in response to, you know, a lot of Colin Kaepernick is in the news, thinking back to, you know, obviously Gwen, who was on the podcast recently that you just mentioned, you know, this sort of weighing between the professional level and their responsibility to not be hypocritical in this time and to actually take a minute, step back and say, you know what, we need to revise our policies, and there's a big demand for that. So coming in a very, very low second is collegiate level for men's. I'm a little surprised, actually it was women's professional level for second. Men's collegiate level was ranking higher than women's as far as who will make the most change. And I find that kind of surprising personally. What do you think, Andrew?
It's kind of what I expected.
Okay.
I think, you know, obviously the men get a dominant voice. We're seeing what's happening in the NBA. You know, they're going back to this like palatial experience that they're going to be having in Florida, barbershops, you know, I mean, spas, all this sort of stuff. And then you talk about the women in the WNBA. And I spent a good 5 to 10 minutes trying to find the story yesterday about the WNBA and what they're doing to return to sports. So that has to tell you something. And it's the reason why we do the types of stories that we do at Global Sport Matters, is to elevate those stories about women, about intersectionality, about race and gender and identity, because it's not being covered in the media. So with that, we're going to bring back all of our panelists to talk about, you know, kind of next steps and, you know, Brian and Kelvin, if you could join. You know, Brian, we'll start with you. And this will be a very interesting question to throw your way. What could you tell us what could Threatcasting tell us about whether or not racism is a threat to the future of sport?
Well, one of the things I can start off by saying is, you know, as a futurist, I model the future. I model future threats, and that's sort of my area of expertise. And I'm not an expert by any means when it comes to racial issues and racial equity. That I don't know. I do know that how I would approach it, and this is why I'm very excited about being on the show and having this conversation. And I really want to thank Dr. Stroman and Ken for having this very frank conversation. And we've not threatcasted the future of racism in sport. Andrew, you and I talked about it.
Yeah.
And I think we do. I think we need to look at, to go back to what Dr. Stroman said, we need to look at the complexity of the data. That's one of the things that this type of thinking, this very systematic thinking allows us to do, is to look at the social science, look at the technology, look at the numbers, look at the cultural history, incredibly important. Talk to the leaders in sport, bring them in. And then get people together. That's one of the things that Threatcasting does, is we bring together people to then have this conversation, to look at the data and think themselves, to walk themselves through the threats and have them discover those threats, and not do it at a big level. Again, be very local. Look at a single person in a single place experiencing racism in sport, and what are we losing? And what are those threats? And then how do we appreciate the complexity of that data and then look at it in the aggregate? and then come back to people with very pragmatic steps to say, here's what it is, here are the indicators, again, going back to that data that it's actually happening, and then what do we do to disrupt, mitigate, and recover? How can we have that conversation? One of the things that we do as a part of our work is we always look at bias. We understand when we bring people into the room, we say everybody has bias, everybody has a point of view. And we are open to that. We need to embrace that. We need to understand that these problems exist. The problems of bias, the problems of racism exist. And it's not a binary existence. They exist, as Dr. Stroman and Ken said, they exist in different levels all throughout society. And we need to have that very open conversation, that frank conversation, which I'm glad that we are having now. It's certainly needed. We need to continue to have it. And that's one of the things that I think we really should use threatcasting as a part of it, because it's a way to have those frank conversations in a very pragmatic way based upon data, but then gets back to the fact that, and the reason why we're doing it is not to say that you're wrong, or it's not to say that's this, it's then what do we do about it? What do we do locally to disrupt and mitigate and recover from it? I think that's a conversation that's needed.
And Kelvin, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement, reach now global audiences in wake of the brutality and the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and sadly so many more. What are you seeing in terms of that impact, that movement spreading across Africa and Asia?
Look, certainly, obviously, in Africa, it's certainly taken on a lot more importance, and you can imagine, the African population feels very, very connected to the situation, and they've experienced it within their own countries, but obviously feel that, these are the people that effectively originally came from Africa, so there's a strong connection. Interestingly enough, and I think often in this discussion, when we start having a global discussion, we often forget that in the world of sport particularly, Asia's been ignored and hasn't necessarily been given the voice that it feels it deserves, and there's quite a bit of I'm not sure I'd use the word anger, but certainly a great deal of frustration in the Asian world about, in specifically within global sports structures, the overhauling of them, how certain voting structures and certain global federations and sports are put together, and where they are, if not excluded, they're certainly not getting the voice that they deserve, given the size of their populations, the prevalence of those sports, etc., in those parts of the world. So I think if we're having a truly global conversation, we really need to also think about Asia's role and what Asia thinks here, because I think often too often, and specifically those of us who perhaps in the English-speaking world, just, we tend to not get exposed enough to what's being said in Asia and what their feelings are around things like that.
Could you give us a specific example, Kelvin, of what that might look like?
It could be, for example, and you'll see, for example, in World Rugby right now, the World Rugby Federation is looking at its voting structures, because effectively the way the voting structure works is that the sort of the 5 home unions, as they call them in France, dominate the voting structure to the extent that you will always see effectively someone out of one of the 5 United Kingdoms, so sort of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, who have I left out? Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, France. One of those people leading World Rugby and dominating the way that World Rugby goes, for example, when rugby today is being played in a number of countries all over the world. It's growing in Asia and places like that. So they're looking at completely overhauling the voting structures that have existed within that environment for so long. We sit in a situation where the IOC has existed now for 124 years. We're going into, another Olympics next year. We've never had anything but a white American or Western European largely leading those organizations through 124 years. Yet we have, 52 countries in Africa. I'm not exactly sure how many in Asia. I'd have to do the count. But, so you're just not even seeing people from those sort of parts of the world leading these organizations. So, from a pure sport perspective, we certainly we need to start thinking about the Asian equation in the global debate around this issue, because it's certainly an issue. Interestingly enough, living in South Africa, we've faced enormous challenges in this space, and you talk about threatcasting, Brian. And one of the interesting things, often government and our sport federations in South Africa are criticized because we have quota systems in terms of our national team selections, right down to our youth team selections, and sort of making teams reflective of the society, because we live in a society where 8% of people in South Africa are white, and yet you'll often see a lot of sports will be 95% dominated by white kids or white players. And specifically in sports where a level of privilege is required, a water polo, for example, where you need to have gone to a school which has a deep pool, and you need all those facilities and everything to ever be able to play the game. And so we almost have this, to that extent, I was just sitting sort of listening to Brian and thinking, we've done a bit of our threat casting here because we've realized that if we don't normalize what teams look like, sport can never be successful. And we've almost had to institutionalize it to make it, sort of stomachable in terms of the way that it moves forward.
Yeah.
So some
and
of
Kelvin,
that threat casting has been taking place.
We were talking about this yesterday in preparation for today's call, but the role of truth and reconciliation that happened there in South Africa. And, Dr. Stroman, we've talked about reparations here in the United States. How much of this is about going back and recognizing, colonialism, recognizing racism, recognizing slavery, and saying, okay, we acknowledge this, we recognize that this is something that has occurred, and as a result of that, we are going to do this. How much of that is that actually going back to those moments?
That is critical. I recently wrote an article in terms of what white people should be doing right now. And I use the acronym ACT, A standing for acknowledge the injustice, and whether that is not gaining access to head coaching positions and you have to have a Rooney Rule, or whether it is not acknowledging what happened to George Floyd and that being an atrocity. This C is for community organize, as in you can't be a lone wolf in this space. And I know there are many white people who are saddened, who are angered, but when you go out on your own, you run the risk of not having information that could tell you that, you might not want to do that, right? You need people to help provide data and information for you, but also you could lose your job, right? If you want to start poking the bear, structural racism. The last one is T, and it's exactly what you're talking about. We need to take heed of the past. We must understand the history. We must understand how colonization happened all across the world, so you can see not only in the United States, but you can see it in Brazil, you can see it in Asia, you can see it in South Africa, where whites are having the best outcomes, blacks are having the worst outcomes, and people of color, indigenous, Native American, Asians, Latinx are situated in between. Now, there is some data that shows in the United States where you have some Asians disaggregated, depends on the Asian population, who are having some outcomes that are better than whites, usually with test scores. But again, it's not long-term, it's not systemic, it's not all across the country. And then you have some data where you have Native Americans who are having a worse outcome than some blacks. But again, still, it's not systemic, it's not across the country. And so wherever you go, you can see this framework, these bookends. And so that's the work that we have to do. We have to acknowledge how race was a specious classification. It was made up by some European scientists who later came back and said that this classification of Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid was just a mess. It doesn't even make any sense. But he knew and he documented that this would last for eternity, and it has. And so when we think about that, and then racism and how that was structured to create advantage for people, whether you say it's from fear or whether it's from greed, but it was created. And so we have a model in every part of the world, and we need to study that so then we can come up with solutions that make sense. You can't have a race-neutral solution to a race-based problem. You can't have a race-neutral solution to a race-based problem. An example would be Brown versus Board. We're more segregated and having more disparities than ever, right? And so we have to think about the past. That is critical. Historians, please step up in this space. It's needed.
So Ken, I'm going to turn back to you on the philosophical. If this was 538.com and we had the needle and it was pointing towards opportunity or threat, where's that needle in your mind? Where are we going? Where are we going?
Well, my best political evasiveness. I mean, the question that we've kind of danced around, even thinking about the future, and I was thinking about this, is what's the ideal? What is it that we are striving for? And Kelvin raises such an interesting issue about the percentages of people in a population and the representation that's in a given sport. And South Africa is almost the flip of us, and we're 13% black. And then whites and others make up the difference. And then you look at the sports leagues, especially basketball's near 90%, football's near 75% African American. I cannot have one of these conversations or write an op-ed piece where the angry white person will not write me back and say, well, what about a Rooney Rule for whites playing in the NBA. Well, that's not, percentages are not the ideal. I mean, that's not, if the white guy can play, he should be able to play too. So to me, what does it look like? I always start classes out like this. What is it that we're striving for? If we're going to talk about race in sports, what is it that we're trying to get to in the end? So, on the, where's the needle? Certainly, and I want to have some optimism in this moment, because there's so much going on. There's not been a moment like this, older people than me are saying in their lifetime. Maybe emancipation felt something more glorious than this. So the needle has moved to the positive, but there's so much more to do, and I cannot emphasize enough. All we got now is the symbolic. We got a couple laws here and there, but the symbolic is not progress. This is, and we may even have some change, which can change back, but progress would be permanent, and we haven't gotten those pieces in place yet.
I mean, and to all of you, it sounds like the people that come to the table and who sits at that table and who has that discussion at that table. I mean, Brian, I could only imagine when you're doing threat casting, sometimes you're looking at the people at the table, especially working with a federal agency, and going, this is not the representation of the people who need to be thinking about these threats. So how are we also conscious about this, that the people who are involved in the solutions, that they're not just saying what's on their mind and seeing the world through that filter, but that to the work that you're trying to do, to be more critical and saying, but you're not seeing it from all these other perspectives. How do we get people to allow more space at the table so that we can both look at threats and opportunities?
Well, I think the first step, Andrew, is to realize that there needs to be more space at the table, and we don't have the right people at the table. That's one of the things that we do as a part of Threatcasting. That is, a futurist is always rigorously asking, who are we not talking to? Who is not here? What is that perspective? If you took one of my classes, if you came to one of those events, you would see we're always constantly interrogating that to say, what are we missing? Because we know there is no perfect, that there is no absolute perfect state, and we embrace that. And we are always interrogating it. But I want to go back to your question about who's sitting at the table, because we take this very serious, and it's something that we've set up in the lab, because as modelers, we decide, we invite people to that room, and that is on us. And so what we do is we look at the population, or who we're the threat area that we are looking to model for. And we say, what does that demographic look like? And then what we create is something called a seat matrix. So we said, okay, this is what we're modeling. So we will need, from a gender breakdown, it looks like this. There are these many seats at the table. From a racial breakdown, these many seats. From a domain expertise, from an age expertise. This is a very important one as well. We start with that. We actually start to say, okay, we need to fill these seats. And so then we actively search. We actively go and fill those seats. And if we can't find a woman of color who's an engineer who we want to have there, the seat remains empty. And we actually talk about it. And we will actually put it in many of our reports to say, this person was not in the room. We need to make sure that we then go follow up with this person. So we are very overt and very aware of the fact that we know that diversity, when it comes to modeling, there have been any number of supporters of that, meaning the people have gotten Nobel Prizes in economics, understanding the diversity of models. People have shown us that in ecosystems, the more diverse your ecosystem, the better. And it's the same thing when we do that modeling. And so we are, number one, we recognize it. And then number two, we actively work against it. Again, going back and using data to do it.
Dr. Stroman, what do you say to the leader who has constantly espoused how important diversity and inclusion is, but then when you look at the actual senior leadership or the leadership of the organization or the people sitting at the table, to Brian's point, there aren't any empty seats, and the acknowledgement of those empty seats? What do you say to them to make that actual change occur now?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, whatever you say, be gentle. Be gentle, because there is nothing like a person who has power, who has authority, and has a budget, who wants to work against your interest, because they will put everything to make sure that whatever objective you have, that it's not going to happen. And so It's as simple as sometimes having private conversations. You can't out someone, you can't call somebody out in a boardroom, right? Or if it's all the senior leaders, the C-suite, you can't do this in that setting. But the idea is, again, to bring the storytelling with the data and say, where is your courage? Where is your courage? You know, we're socialized and conditioned in our country that once you become a leader, once you get, you know, your terminal degree and all those things, is that kiss the ring. We know everything. And this is a space in particular where we have to understand that, you know what, I don't know enough. I might not know much at all. We have to be lifelong learners. And so getting the key leaders with the authority, with the budgets, all of that, to recognize that it's okay to say, I don't know, and that I want to learn. But instead, everything that's pushed to us is that you're the authority. That means you know how to do everything. And in this space, not so, because we're not teaching it well K through 12. It's hard to find it and get it taught and respected in higher education. And so we end up in this quagmire, this mess where people are in charge of units, they're in charge of divisions, in the federal government, nonprofit world, where they're in charge of this, but they don't have much of an understanding at all. And so that's why we're seeing corporate statements that have to be rewritten over and over again, because to Brian's point, who was sitting at the table, who was actually helping the language? There's just so much going on now where we have the ego in play versus understanding that this is a domain that I'm just not familiar with. Yes, I'm still a leader, but I need to be educated more.
And Kelvin, can you talk about the role of sport and how sport brought your country together?
Oh yeah, that's a long story. It's probably a story on its own. But I think just two things there quickly, and then I'll get on to that. Is I listen to everything that's been said, and I think it's 100% correct. I think sport does have an enormous opportunity and responsibility to use this moment to really get behind these type of movements. I also think that it doesn't necessarily matter today just how and whether you're sitting at the table or not, because one thing that social and digital media has brought around, and it's a trend we've been talking about in the Nielsen sport business for some time, the sort of new content creators is that what we call the athlete editor. You know, and what social and digital media allowed is these athletes to stand up and say what they want to say and get their message across. They don't need to do it through a broadcast partner of the league or through the team's PR channels, or they have this opportunity to go bigger. And in fact, a lot of these athletes today are bigger than the teams that they play for. And through this situation, we've seen here in South Africa, Siya Kolisi, who's the we have a sport that we were world champions in South Africa, Rugby World Cup. And for the first time in the history of rugby, we had a black captain of a World Cup winning team. And what he's done socially in this country over the last 90 days has been extraordinary. You know, if you follow the story of Marcus Rashford, the Manchester United striker, and what he's done and how he's taken on the English government and got them back feeding schemes into schools, into the summer holidays. So these athletes have enormous opportunity today. And I think what we're going to see is it's not going to necessarily be the people sitting at the table that drive the change. It's going to be these athletes and these individuals who stand up. Lewis Hamilton in Formula One. So, and that, for example, going back to my story about South Africa, is it never really existed here in the early 90s when we sort of got back into I would say a normal society. We're still not a normal society today, but you know, it was always through official channels, and it was largely driven by President Nelson Mandela, who I think is well documented at the launch of Laureus just 20 years ago, where he spoke about sports power to change the world, and that it exists. And he sought, if any of you have watched the movie Invictus, you know, you might be familiar with the story. I'm sure most of you weren't watching the Rugby World Cup in 1995 when South Africa won here in Johannesburg, and Nelson was out there, and how he used rugby to talk to the large white Afrikaans population of South Africa about what a future South Africa would look like. So sport has played a very interesting role in South Africa, and has probably been the one unifying factor for South Africans of all race groups over the last 30, 40 years. At times it becomes very fractious because people get emotional about it, but it's also been an extraordinary platform to use to get to people to start having the conversations they need to have that they wouldn't have in the workplace, they're not mixing socially, but in a sports field and in a sports environment is where that's taken place. And you know, you get some really I think contradictory things on these. You know, I grew up, and it sounds ridiculous to tell you this, but I never played against people of another race or color until I was 18 years old. 18 years old before I played sport against people of another color. When I left school. So that's the sort of environment I grew up in, obviously growing up in Southern Africa and South Africa at the time. But an extraordinary thing happened in the 80s, and it happened in a sport called cricket. We had a rebel tour by West Indies cricket team. West Indies is what they call a sort of group of the Caribbean islands that play cricket, and they came to South Africa on a rebel tour because obviously we were banned from international sport. And obviously there was a huge amount of anger within black South Africans, within the Caribbean, that these people had effectively taken the money and come to play sport against white South Africans. As a young white kid at the time, it was the first time I'd gone to watch black people play sport in a professional environment. And as a young teenager, I had heroes now. I mean, I still remember them today, two gentlemen in particular, Collis King, and Hartley Elaine, who ended up coming to live in South Africa and play cricket here. And so as a 13-year-old South African white kid who'd grown up, gone only to school with white people, had only played sport with white people, had only mixed really socially with white people, my two biggest cricket sporting heroes became black people. And so sport has that incredible power, even in situations like that, which are extremely fractious. And I think that's where the storytelling comes in. That's where the truth and reconciliation, we can do the numbers and the stats, and I'm in the research business. I agree with Dr. Stroman just how important that is. But the storytelling of that is the powerful bit that where you really see what sport can do.
Absolutely. Ken, I'll give you the final word.
Well, Kelvin just reminded me, not only did Nelson Mandela, of course, learn the Afrikaans language, but he also learned the white sport rugby. I mean, he thought that was as important to learn as the language in order to speak, strike deals with the oppressor. I do want to say that, so we consciously chose to move forward with this on Juneteenth as a way to think of this as they say on Martin Luther King Day, not a day off, but a day on to continue the that needs to be done in this kind of moment. And I can't overemphasize my viewpoint about the idea of getting beyond the symbolism and trying to move forcefully to really take advantage of, as everybody's pointed out, some of the progress that has been made in this moment. The whole focus of this conversation is on the future and threat and how far can we get. So I do want to end with my final statements being there can be a bright future if we continue the momentum that's underway now.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we've run out of time. I want to thank Dr. Deb Stroman, Ken Shropshire, Kelvin Watt, Brian David Johnson. Thank you for being here. This was a great conversation, and the conversation does not end just because we've stopped talking. We would love for you to continue to engage with us. We have all of our social media platforms. We'll be producing podcasts, way into the summer and beyond. So we hope that you continue to follow what we're doing in our work. Also, too, the Global Sport Matters will be launching a new website. Hopefully next week. We've been working on it really hard. We're getting to the finish line and everything's looking really great. So with that, we'll end our discussion, but I will hand it back over to Kendall.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to dismiss our wonderful panelists. Thank you again if you need to get going. And I ask our attendees to just hold on for a minute. And we've got our next GSM Live coming up next Friday, the 26th. So basically, once again, in celebration of our community. So Global Pride Day is Saturday, June 27th. So our show is one day before that. And Pride Month has been going on the whole June month. And so we are going to be speaking about LGBTQ plus pride in sport, thinking about, the Supreme Court decision that was recently granted to protect workers' rights. And what does that mean across the world? How are we including? How are we protecting? And how do we create more pride within sport? So we've got some great panelists lined up, including Ashlyn Johnson, the president of Inclusion Playbook. We also have from Outsports, which is another research-based organization in the European Union that is looking at how do we combat, if you will, and really raise awareness to eradicate homophobia. And we will also be welcoming Billy Bean, who is really prolific within the MLB. He is assistant to the commissioner and many initiatives around LGBTQ inclusion within the MLB. So we're really excited. We've dropped our next show link there for you and hope that you'll join us next week, once again, Friday, June 26th, for our next conversation at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern. With that, I will let our music roll us out. Thanks everybody for joining.